To begin, I want to give a huge thanks to the National Minority Quality Forum for the special focus on sickle cell disease. I serve as Assistant Commissioner for Minority Health at FDA, and one of the earliest efforts that I was involved with when I came back to the agency as a bit of history, FDA's Office of Minority Health was one of the offices that were established under the Affordable Care Act of 2010. So our office is a relatively young office. I came back, I started, I'd been at FDA previously, but came back to help get the office established in 2012. And one of the first efforts that we had the privilege of being involved with was to be part of the, under the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, the Patient-Focused Drug Development Program. And so as a bit of history in that space, some of you all may know Dr. Ann Farrell, who is the Division Director of the Division of Hematologic Drug Products in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. So I suddenly got these messages from Ann, and when we finally connected in real time, as you know, you can do a lot of phone tag and email tag. It turned out that she was concerned because the final list of diseases for the patient-focused drug development meetings did not include sickle cell disease. The list had gone out from the agency, and how many of you all get the Federal Register? Anybody subscribe to the Federal Register? It's a minority of the folks in here. But the reason it's important to do that because the way government communicates out on what we're doing is through the Federal Register. We are required to send out, and that's mandated under the Administrative Procedures Act. So it's something that you can actually get your own specialized feed for the agency or department of your choice. But if you wanted to stay up to date on advisory committee meetings, public meetings, calls for input, that's the way to get it. So what had happened was that the agency was prepared when the law was enacted and signed by then President Obama to issue a Federal Register notice asking for public input into a laundry list of diseases of which sickle cell disease was included. What we got back to the docket, because dockets, when they're open, require responses. So you get Federal Register notices thrown over the fence, and from the agency's perspective, we take a look at what's thrown back at us in response. So sickle cell, there were thousands of responses, just to put some context to this, but sickle cell was not spoken to. Now, the takeaway from that is that for advocacy groups, and particularly for patient advocacy groups, we're on a different kind of trajectory, and it's a different one now than it was 5 years ago in terms of patient engagement. But because, and I really have to give credit to Dr. Farrell, we all knew that there is still, in 2017, one approved product for sickle cell disease. We knew that patients were suffering. We knew that more needed to be done. And so we did a little bit of conversation with some of our colleagues, and they agreed that the need was great. It was a true unmet medical need. And so sickle cell disease was added to the list of meetings that the agency was going to convene. So on February 7, 2014, FDA convened this meeting. And with all due credit to the sickle cell community, you turned out amazingly. At that point, it was the best attended meeting. The framework of questions that the agency asked for input on: what is the disease like, how are treatments working, what's working well, and what's not. What are your unmet medical needs? And to get that from the patient perspective. That meeting led to a subsequent meeting that we did with the Brookings Institute to do more dialogue around how do we mature these, take this information, refine it into endpoints. And so where we are now, and I'm just thrilled to be up here with the gentleman to my left, is that we have seen a significant uptick in development, which we're just absolutely thrilled about because of the significant public health need, the unmet medical need. So without further ado on my part, I will in turn have our panelists speak to their programs. We have Dr. Kenneth Bridges here from Global Blood Therapeutics, serves as a vice president there, and did a little bit of research on you, Ken, and you really go way back with hemoglobinopathies, back to when he was on faculty at the Brigham. So it's just nice to see your trajectory and the work you're doing now. And to his left, we have Dr. Kollmer from Pfizer, who will talk about their program. And then Bill Hobbs is here from BioVeritiv, and he'll talk about the programs that they have underway there addressing hemoglobinopathies. So thank you all so much for sticking with us this afternoon, and I think you'll find this a very informative session.
Okay, well, thanks. Thanks, Jonca, and thanks everybody for being here. And it's really quite a thrill and a pleasure to be here, having a chance to share with you some of the things that we've done and are doing at Global Blood. As Jonca mentioned, I've been a hematologist by training. I've been involved in the hematology sphere for a while. I had the pleasure of really working with many of the really outstanding individuals here in the room over the years, and have seen sickle cell disease move forward, not quickly as not as quickly as we would have liked in many instances, but certainly it has moved forward. I think that for me, this has been a particularly rewarding situation coming to Global Blood, because as a hematologist and seeing the suffering and working with patients and working with the community there in Boston and in other places, it really became very clear that there was even with the advance of hydroxyurea, and hydroxyurea was a big advance, but there was really a very great unmet medical need, that we really needed to move beyond and to have something additional for patients who are suffering from sickle cell disease. When I learned of the efforts by Global Blood, the development of a new treatment, which is now in trials, it was something in a way of a surprise, because the understanding of how to approach this is very clear. If you understand once it's very clear what the biophysics and the molecular structure of hemoglobin is and its relationship to oxygen. That approach has been tried, but unsuccessfully at times in the past. I must say that the chemists, and these were chemists at Global Blood who developed this compound, which is now GBT440, that's the compound we're working with, did a remarkable job of developing a compound that is specific for the or highly specific for the hemoglobin molecule binding to the specific area in the chain, affecting oxygen affinity, and as a result, decreasing the polymerization. Polymerization is really the key for everything that happens in sickle cell disease. But and beginning those studies showing that the drug is well tolerated, or looking at the drug's tolerability and efficacy, it became very clear that we had to involve large and important elements of the community. You can't develop a drug in isolation. That is something which is not either feasible nor desirable. And so GBT had the very early recognition of the need to partner with not only physicians, but with patient advocacy groups and with others who have an interest in sickle cell disease. And this has been something which is a very special mission on the part of our company, Ted Love, our CEO, who was here yesterday, and I think many of you heard his discussion on this, really emphasizing how important it was for us to work as a community developing this drug, to get this drug through to a test and to show, or at least to have the chance to show that it will have a positive effect on sickle cell disease. My impression, and it's been very, very profound, that, for instance, our company has worked on trying to address some of the issues that have come up here in earlier discussions, issues of geography, transportation. Patients, for their primary care or for the primary maintenance, have problems or potentially problems getting to sites. And to come for a study, that's an added burden. And so we've had things such as transportation, providing transportation as necessary, reimbursements for expenditures that are necessary to come and do these things, because it is a big burden. Sickle cell, and we've heard this so importantly from people who have talked today about the situation that the patients who are affected and their families, because it's not just the patients, it affects the entire family. The patients who are affected and their families have profound issues to deal with, of which sickle cell is only part of it. And so to the extent that we now add another complexity that has come in for a study, how can we make that more an easier task for patients? And so that's been something for us that's been very important. We've had the opportunity of working with the SCDAA, which is very, very important, and we've had a chance to work with many of the other advocacy groups in the country, both locally and nationally. And I think that it's really through those kinds of efforts that will allow us to move forward. Our studies, we've just now begun our phase 3 studies and looking at enrolling at this point up to 400 patients worldwide. That's a lot of people, and that means a lot of work with advocacy groups, with patients, and with physicians to make sure that people understand what we could potentially bring in the future.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess I'll start out and talk a little bit about our sickle cell portfolio, but then also I'd like to touch on patient engagement and community engagement, because we feel like that's extremely important, crucial to engaging patients and their families when it comes to developing new molecules, turning molecules into medicines. So we've got, at Pfizer, we've got 2 programs ongoing. We have Rivapansel, which is an IV product used in the hospital for patients who are admitted for a vaso-occlusive crisis. That's administered twice a day for up to 7 days. As we confirmed last year, we're on schedule to commit to complete enrollment in the second half of 2018. So unlike Ken's asset, this is, first of all, it's an acute agent versus a prophylactic agent. And Rivapansel works on the adhesive interactions between white blood cells, endothelium, and platelets that occur during a crisis. So our hypothesis is that this ameliorates these adhesive interactions, and although you still have sickled cells, this opens up and allows your blood to flow more freely, therefore helping to ameliorate the crisis. Our other asset that we're working on is a PDE9 inhibitor that's just completed phase 1. We'll be talking about that at the FSCDR sickle cell meeting later this week. I can tell you that also influences adhesive interactions, and as a matter of fact, we've done intravital microscopy looking at rodents, and when Rivapansel is administered to a sickle cell mouse model, you see virtually physically, in terms of increased blood flow, you'll see that when both these compounds are administered, so that ultimately they seem to have a very similar effect. I'm going to step back and talk about how we kind of approached the whole sickle cell opportunity. And I do think it's an incredibly exciting, pivotal time to be involved in change in sickle cell. I think we're on the cusp of some therapies that are going to be the first innovation since, HU was repurposed from chemotherapeutic to a prophylactic agent. What we're finding, and kudos to the FDA for the patient-focused drug development forum. I'll never forget that because I was stuck in a blizzard and watching that on TV and watching my kids at the same time. And the NIH also had an excellent patient engagement symposium. Most patients, and I don't think it's just limited to sickle cell, don't really understand the concept of clinical trials. It's daunting, intimidating, scary. Anytime you say experimental medicine, people wonder, well, what could go wrong? So there's definitely has been a need for education. And then the question also is who's best suited to deliver that education? So is it us, is it pharma, is it the CBOs, is it SCADA, is it the individual HCPs? So I think all those are potential sources, and what we found is patients tend to listen to the sources, just like all of us, that they trust the most. We started out back in 2012, actually before we embarked on our phase 3 program for rivipansel, and we hired an ethnographer to go out, and ethnographers are PhD anthropologists trained in social sciences. So they went out and, with their consent of course, followed several dozen patients with sickle cell disease at their homes, see where they got their information, what their lives were like, what their concerns were like, and even followed some through medical care. And we've had many of those patients come in and talk to us at Pfizer about what their lives are like and how sickle cell has impacted their lives and their family. And we did find there's concerns in terms of, transportation is huge, and we also are reimbursing for we're actually providing free transportation to patients to the hospital and back. I think, some of the other things we found out is, okay, how are these patients, who can influence them? And again, this comes back to the community, and not only about clinical trials in general, but how medicines are created that without participating, if you have the disease and you don't participate in a clinical trial, then you can't be part of the solution. So if there was one message I'd like to communicate out to patients is that, come down off the stands, get on the floor and get engaged. And it is scary, but there's, we're accumulating data. As we accumulate more data, we have more confidence in the safety and hopefully the efficacy of the products that we're testing. So I think those are my initial remarks anyway.
Okay, thank you. Bill?
All right. My name is Bill Hobbs. I'm from BioVeritiv. I lack a name tag, so I'll say BioVeritiv again, mostly because we are a new company, and it's great to be bald and gray and still be able to refer yourself as new and young. I like that part of it. BioVeritiv began operations in February, so when I say we're new, I mean we're really new. We were part of Biogen up until February. We were spun out of Biogen as a hematology group that was mainly focused on our hemophilia franchise. That includes 2 approved drugs for hemophilia that were the first long-acting clotting factors available for hemophilia, and a major advance for patients with hemophilia. And we sort of look at that as our innovative core of our mission. And at BioVeritiv, our interest has been to expand into blood disorders broadly, and sickle cell disease specifically. And that's built, of course, upon our experience at Biogen, where I've interacted with some of you wearing a prior Biogen hat on our sickle cell disease programs from there. We have a slightly more ambitious view of sickle cell disease at BioVeritiv now. And one of our programs is a collaboration with Sangamo Therapeutics on a cell and gene therapy approach for sickle cell disease, which is a gene editing approach. Highly innovative, a little bit different than some of the programs you've heard before, in that it is envisioned as a one-time therapy that is delivered with the patient's own cells that are obtained from the patient, treated outside the body, and then returned to the patient as part of a bone marrow transplant procedure. The intent of the biology behind it and the hypothesis behind it is that the treatment of the cells outside the body with a gene editing agent, which is a zinc finger nuclease in this case, will change the expression of globin in those cells from the sickle hemoglobin back to the fetal hemoglobin that we all express when we're born. And it's, I think, quite well known that fetal hemoglobin is protective against the effects of sickle cell disease. And by substituting high levels of fetal hemoglobin, we hope to ameliorate the disease. This would be envisioned as, of course, a one-time therapy if it's effective. A very different type of development approach than something that is envisioned either for acute prophylaxis of a VOC crisis or for chronic management of the disease to prevent complications. And that means that there are slightly different potential risks, slightly different benefits, and slightly different patient populations that may be involved. And of course, an entirely different development approach and a different approach with patients, the community, and the healthcare system, as well as federal agencies, including regulatory, and others. I guess in terms of more specific to this session, I mean, this is, I have to say, this is a really fantastic experience for me. I've been involved in sickle cell disease for a while, not perhaps quite as long as Dr. Bridges, but for much of my academic and career, practicing as a physician, treating sickle cell patients, I was always struck by the frustration when patients came in saying, the current therapy that you have for me, hydrea or transfusion, isn't effective. What else can you do for me? And all I'd be able to say really is, well, did you drink enough water today? This really should not be our innovative therapies in this day and age. And it's taken this long to get to go from the science to translate that to medicines, which are now in development that are really exciting across the board from a number of different companies. What that fundamentally means, from our perspective, and I think from the patient and community perspective as well, is that there are now multiple clinical trial options for patients. We hope that there'll be multiple actual therapy options in the future. But if Global Blood Therapeutics is looking at 400 patients, and Pfizer is looking for 400 patients, and BioVerative is looking for 400 patients across different spectrums, that's a lot of individuals to get involved in clinical trials. And broadening that base of people in the community willing to consider the benefit-risk balance of participating in a clinical trial for which you don't know if there's a benefit and you can't fully describe all of the risks fully is a big deal. And I think if, as a community, we want to have multiple options for patients, we have to be able to drive a lot more participation in clinical trial programs. And I think the core of that is a lot of what the activity at this type of summit is really at, and which is what one of my old mentors used to say, if you can't distill something down to 10 words, then it's probably not worth trying to communicate. But the 10 words or less is information to change perception based on education, which is, I think there's a lot of perception about what it means to participate in a clinical trial. I think there's a lot of perception amongst industry about what sickle cell is and what it isn't as a patient population and as a community. And I think there's a lot of perception amongst the healthcare system as well about sickle cell disease, which by accumulating a lot more information, we can do a better job educating all of us about that. I mean, for industry in particular, speaking as a new company in sickle cell disease, developing new therapies and trying to take advantage of great science to develop new medicines. It's learning what actually matters most to patients and communities, how that harmonizes with the healthcare system needs, so that we focus on the right types of therapies that actually matter and that can actually meet the needs of both the patients and the healthcare systems, and we can deliver them effectively. For a cell and gene therapy, that's a high mountain to climb because it's a very different way about thinking of developing a drug with a new technology platform that is very foreign to a lot of people. So there's a lot of information and education to be done along those lines. I think there's a lot of levels to work with the healthcare system itself. in terms of understanding the impact of sickle cell disease on care systems, and that escalates upwards as well to social policy and legislative issues as well. I thought the prior session on the hemophilia system and adjacencies there was really informative in terms of that, because I think we all understand that moving forward in sickle cell disease is a team effort on multiple levels that will include social and legislative policy. I think the challenges are, I think for the first time we're getting close to actually having to meet them and deal with them head on. These programs are moving fast and are having some success now in the clinic, which is a great thing for everybody. And hopefully we'll continue moving on with a teamwork and collaborative approach.
Okay. Thank you very much. A couple of takeaways for me in listening to the programs is that the mechanism of action is unique to each of these programs. I think there was a common theme, though, of the need to address recruitment into clinical trials, and sickle cell disease falls into the orphan drug category. For United States regulations, less than 200,000 patients and a limited pool. And I think, you touched on not everybody wants to be in a trial. But if we've got estimates of between 90 to 100,000 sickle cell patients, 1,200 doesn't sound like that high a bar across the three programs, but the reality is that it is a high bar. Sickle cell is also unique that it's a global disease, and that in terms of looking at developing programs that can potentially recruit patients outside of the United States is also another opportunity. Wanted to share that the meeting that we had with the sickle cell community, one of the things that struck me most was patients weren't asking for a cure. They were asking for help with pain, asking for help with living with the day-to-day ravages of the disease. And what I'm hearing here is actually you all are raising the bar in terms of looking at methods of treatment that may be somewhat curative, that could prevent crises, and I'm sure the fear on a day-to-day basis of, is this going to be a good day or a really horrible bad day? And so interested from whoever would like to take this question.
Right. Thanks, Jonca. I think that your comment about the FDA having the meeting with patients is vital, because it points to the fact that in the past we've looked a lot at hospitalization, the so-called VLC, and as we now know, that's only a part of it, and certainly many of the folks here, as well as other people, Wally Smith, et cetera, have shown what practicing people, clinicians who took care of patients, knew that there was a lot of suffering that did not result in going to hospitalization. And it was important to really try and address that. And one of the things that we were able to take away, that is GBT, was to develop a patient-reported outcome tool that will that it's incorporated into our phase 3 trial, and that will be allow looking at aspects of the patient burden that is not solely looking at VOC, so looking at daily symptoms that will capture both pain and fatigue. Fatigue is, of course, as everyone here, I'm sure most people here know, is very important. So what we are looking at to do, certainly in our trial, is to assess this entire burden, and this will be a key outcome of our trial itself. And that if we can show that this is something that, one, is important to patients, and two, that we can have an impact on, then we think that we'll have something that will be vital and valuable to both patients and providers, and most importantly to society as a whole, because we are, by not addressing this vital aspect, and we heard this from people earlier today who are affected by sickle cell disease, that the ability to become part of society, the ability to fulfill your potential is something that the sickle cell is just a part that holds you back. And if we could begin to address how to unchain people, it's like Hercules Unchained. There's a lot of energy out there. There's a lot of intellect. There's a lot of power out there in these patients. And if we can unleash that, it will be very, very powerful. And we can do that by really working all of us together.
Let me just mention, some of you in the audience may be familiar with with legislation that was signed back in December, the 21st Century Cures Act. And a major aspect of that legislation and that informs FDA's work is developing methodologies to capture patient experience. So that, in many ways, is potentially game-changing because it's not what the doctor thinks anymore in terms of endpoints. It's going to increasingly move us toward diseases where the endpoint is, does the patient think that some good has happened for them? So, Carl, any thoughts here?
Yeah, I'm 100% aligned with Ken on this. And for our prophylaxis agent, we also have a health outcomes tool where patients are reporting their own outcomes, and we're considering things like fatigue, quality of sleep, ability to perform their everyday functions, and so forth. So I think that is, for any kind of prophylaxis agent, that's essential. It's not just about hospitalization, obviously. One thing you touched on was going global, and I think certainly sickle cell's a rare disease here in the States. Not some places it's very common. So the question I think is how do you get the infrastructure in place to do clinical trials on a more global basis, and then dealing with logistics in terms of if you have drug that needs to be refrigerated, drawing lab samples and so forth. So I think that's a challenge. Some of my colleagues have just got back from Ghana a few weeks ago and met there and learned more about barriers to even things like using HU because it's so hard to get blood draws to monitor for toxicity. So that's, in Africa, even HU is a problem. So the other part of the equation I think I'd like to speak to, because I see it as a looming crisis, and I've got some of our investigators in this room, and I know they are swamped. I don't know how much time they have to devote to clinical trials, but I'm guessing maybe 5 or 10%. And the point I want to make is we're running out of expert sickle cell disease experts in the U.S. So we have this explosion in clinical trials. Who's going to do them? So I think they're getting saturated, and there's overflow. We're going to other countries, going to Europe. So how do we encourage younger physicians to develop expertise in non-malignant hematology, because most of them go into oncology. And, so I don't know that I can solve that here, but I just want to throw that out as a challenge for the community that we need to try and nurture some of those careers so that we have a future set of caregivers for these patients, especially when these therapies come through. I think just one more thought on protocol. So I would have loved to have been a fly on your wall when you're working on your. So, and we've actually, one thing we've done is pulled in patients from the community. So for our PD9 phase 2 program, we had convened about 13 patients last year and a couple of advocates without sickle cell disease. We got them in a room for a day and went through the basics of our protocol, our consent, things like that. And, I think traditionally pharma thinks about a development plan and you engage with your KOLs and you engage with regulators and then you go. You just, because there's so much speed, hurry up, do it faster. And we actually were allowed the time to kind of assimilate what we've heard from patients and to integrate that into our protocols, both the protocols we have ongoing, so that not only both to make the procedures more patient-friendly, and we talked about the trials are a huge burden, so we put out there, okay, here's the planned visit schedule. What does that look like to you? If we ask you to fill out a diary every day for a year, can you do that? Or after 3 months, are you going to get tired of it and say, I'm done? So I think, and this is not just sickle cell, I think, anytime you're planning a clinical trial even if it's not a rare disease, the more you can involve patients early on, the more I think they really appreciate and respect that, and I think it's essential if you're going to succeed.
Yeah, it's interesting, going back to your original question about patients, the patient-centered forum that highlighted, patients wanted therapies that treated pain and were interested in sleep and fatigue and things. I think for a long time, as providers and as patients, our expectations in sickle cell disease were really quite low. The types of therapies that we were historically thinking about that were coming forward for sickle cell disease were really incremental effects at best. And for a long time, there was a lot of discussion about that there would need to be some sort of combination type therapies, almost like a chemotherapy model, because none of the individual drugs were going to work all that well. And so the vision was maybe there would be a combination of 4 or 5 drugs that people would need to be on, as opposed to one really good one. And so in some ways, I look at this as part of education and perception too, that as providers and patients and community, we should expect better efficacy. And we should expect things that fundamentally change the underlying disease, that are disease modifying and really do change the way that people live. Not to diminish that, having better pain medication isn't important, it is. But it's a longer way of saying as well that sickle cell disease, the patients are not monolithic. I mean, this is a very heterogeneous disease. Patients have very different interpretations of what's important to them. There are a lot of different populations, and it's why it makes a lot of sense, I think, that there probably will be multiple therapies approved at some point in the future, because there are such different manifestations of the disease and such different expectations for what efficacy means to different patients. That feeds back into the design of the clinical trial too, because it's not necessarily true that the same type of patient that would want to enroll in a GBT440 or the Pfizer PDE9 inhibitor would be the same type of patient that would want to enroll in a cell and gene therapy trial, which I think would be a different population that is far more severely affected, for whom they're thinking about allotransplant because of recurrent stroke or high risk of stroke or recurrent acute chest syndrome or other more severe complications. So I think that a lot of that feeds into how we design trials and how we find patients that would be interested in those benefit risk, because they're quite different across the population.
I was going to ask us, one of the areas that we're seeing change in clinical trials overall was part of one of the co-study leads for a project out of the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative on patient recruitment. And one of our recommendations from that project was to reduce the study burden, get rid of unnecessary amendments to protocols, really focus on what is the core scientific question. And another area that I'm intrigued by is technology. We talked about fatigue, so movement during the day. Are there ways to reduce the burden to patients, reduce the number of study visits that remote capture of data or alternative means of capturing data are informing your trials? Just wondering, is technology potentially going to help in trial execution for your programs?
Well, yeah, I think that certainly one of the aspects of the PRO that I just mentioned is that it's electronic. It's on a phone. It looks like the phone everybody has in their pocket. Everybody pull out one, you can have one. And that's precisely what it is. It's a Samsung phone, but it doesn't have phone capabilities. But 9 questions. It's 9 questions answered. That would take 9 questions each with 4 potential answers about how they feel about different aspects of what they've happened during the day. So you can capture all this information, of course, without a visit. It's uploaded immediately to the cloud, and so data is not lost, and it allows then a real-time tracking of how patients are doing. So I think you're right that the use of technology will make certain aspects of this much, much more, not only easier for patients, but also more reflective of what patients are really doing, because they really will have the chance to do this on a real-time basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is not to go back to the hemophilia example, but certainly for hemophilia, an electronic patient diary is part of the clinical development program for evaluating endpoints and has been used for a long time there. I think for sickle cell disease, some of the new scoring measures, we just need a little bit more information on how valid they are across the population. But ultimately, though, I think what we would all like is one common way to evaluate it so that when we talk about whatever the patient variable is, we're all using the same language and the same scoring system, and we can sort of understand what different efficacy means and what different profiles mean together.
Okay, well, I think we actually are at a point where we can begin to take some questions from the audience. Thank you.
So you led me into my question, actually, and that as a provider for quite a few individuals living with sickle cell disease, I actually think it's kind of unlikely that we're ever going to find one biomarker or one method of assessment because this disease is so heterogeneous. And as a result, my question is actually for Jonca. I want to know, when we are with a disease that desperately needs treatment, is the FDA really going to require the full gamut of phase 3 randomized placebo-controlled trials, while that's always been the golden, standard? If you have an excellent phase 2 trial that's placebo-controlled and demonstrates efficacy, would that ever be sufficient?
Love your question. And I can only speculate, but I think there's some grounding for my speculation. The law that I referenced, the 21st Century Cures Act, also requires FDA to embrace alternative means of data, data collection that would potentially, I think, help, that you could take, for example, a product that clearly had to show promise, had a reasonable risk to benefit profile, but could have some sort of introduction into market that might require registry, might require some sort of controlled access through, only hematologists. But I think we really are moving into an era where we're going to see different strategies that may be acceptable, particularly in areas of unmet medical need, and making a compelling argument in that regard. So I think it's what you described writ large is certainly worth discussion with the agency, and I can assure you there's receptivity to it. Yeah.
Hi, this question is for our industry panelists. In conversations with a number of patients and patient groups, one of the things that come up in terms of conversations around clinical trials has to do with, at the conclusion of a clinical trial, many of them express that they don't really hear back from the pharmaceutical company about the actual results of the studies. What is your particular company doing to address this issue?
I'll go first. Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up, and that's been recognized for some time, and I think due to all the legal and other requirements, it's been somewhat tough, and I have to admit industry's probably been slower than we'd like to respond. I can say at Pfizer we have a dedicated work stream working on this because we have heard from patients loud and clear they don't want to just, nor would I want to just finish something up and then go on with life and not even know if you're on placebo or not, much less have all your results. So I think there's room for improvement, and we hear you.
I'll just add to that one of the concerns the agency has had in the past is how that disclosure would be handled and that it wouldn't be done in a promotional way. So, but I completely agree when folks put themselves at risk, that there's a responsibility to share with them what their disposition was in the trial. So.
I mean, I think likely this would go through the investigator back to the patient as opposed to direct. I think that would be the most appropriate.
Yeah, and we're certainly considering that, much as you say, Carl, the same way. It's something that you have to be very, very careful about, but it's very, very important to address to make sure that patients do feel included. Otherwise, you don't feel you're being used as a subject, but you're not a individual who is sharing in this expedition.
Hi, My name is Ann Simpson. I'm a physician, geriatrician, but also healthcare ethicist. And in response to the question about the phase 2 trial intervention, whatever it is, would that be an appropriate situation in which someone could apply for a single patient protocol for a study intervention that takes the patient or doesn't even put them in the study but allows them to go into treatment?
So you're talking about expanded access?
It would be expanded access for the type of situation she asked about.
Well, one caveat here is that if the agency accepted a development program based on phase 2 data, and I can assure you this happens a lot in the oncology space. I mean, things zip from IND to approval or along an accelerated pathway quite rapidly. So there's really some precedent for this, but the expanded access piece is when the product's not approved yet, and that's done largely under what is essentially a single IND. So you would need a cooperating physician, you'd need a company that's willing to provide product. It's certainly possible. My experience with that historically has been that companies are reluctant to do it because that might be the one patient that something goes drastically wrong with. And there also are issues of cost of the therapy itself, cost of delivering care that wouldn't be under the trial. So it gets a bit it's not that it couldn't be done, but there would be some other factors that would have to be addressed for that to happen. But the agency has certainly been actively working. There's, you may be aware of this broader movement of right to try at the state level, that experimental therapies be made more accessible when patients may not be within the definitions of the inclusion criteria. So, other questions? Was that a hand back there? I'm concerned that, part of this conversation that was touched on in terms of the dwindling numbers of specialists taking care of sickle cell patients could be a major crisis point for us here. Because what I'm taking from that comment is that it's not just a struggle. We're dealing with an orphan disease with an orphan population of specialists that care for them that would be willing to serve as investigators. And that's, in terms of looking at training programs, incentive programs that might be run out of NHLBI, other groups that have a commitment to sickle cell. Was on a session one of the earlier sessions, gentleman that's finishing up his fellowship program in pediatric nephrology and was part of a fellowship program that nurtured bringing more people into that field, certainly might be the seed of an idea that needs to go back and needs to be addressed. Because if we don't have folks taking care, and I see the hand from someone there.
So I'd love to speak to your question. So I'm Latasha Lee, Manager of Sickle Cell Disease Policy and Programs at the American Society of Hematology, the largest organization for hematologists caring for both benign and malignant hemoglobinopathies. And so to address that, our multifaceted sickle cell disease initiative, which Dr. Thompson spoke of earlier, is aimed at access to care issues, and primarily not only just training hematologists, but also primary care physicians, hospitalists, and others. As part of our coalition, we've teamed up with the Emergency Room Collaborative, who is also working on care paradigms and others to address the emergency room issues with sickle cell care. Additionally, we have partnered with the NHLBI on some training programs around hematology, and there are a number of other minority health initiatives involving potential individuals who will serve as benign hematologists aimed at treating sickle cell disease patients, which are underway. But it's a great point, and I think that that's one in which ASH is strongly committed to, is this is the first disease-specific initiative that the society has ever taken on.
Thank you very much. I wanted to just acknowledge my colleague from HHS, Dr. Ivy, who's here from her. How you doing? And you were on an earlier panel, and he's done some really impressive work under their program. So, other questions here? Yes.
So I actually sit on the NHLBI advisory panel for sickle cell disease, and we haven't met in quite a long time, as it turns out. And I guess my point on that one is it seems like people at the Institute have really kind of given up to some degree on trying to be very novel about thinking in terms of sickle cell disease. A few years, or almost a decade ago now, they kind of gave up on small molecule treatments, and so I was really concerned, I was really happy or energized by the fact that there are now small molecules being derived that actually impact the care of patients with sickle cell disease. I guess the heavy bet was on genetics that is evolving, but it's not evolving so quickly that I think we should rule out small molecule therapies. So my question is, where's the impetus to make it easy for people to get back into the thinking about small molecule business? Because I agree that there may be multiple solutions, multiple small molecules that may still be effective. And although it hadn't really happened the previous 50 years, and now there seems to be a strong interest, maybe we got into a point now where small molecules might be back in again.
Yeah, no, I think, Bill, you make a really great point. I think that what's happened with hematology or red cells and hemoglobin is that, of course, the structure of that molecule was the first crystallized large protein that we know of, and so much of the work early on was done around aspects of the molecule, looking at small molecular interactions, how the contact points on the hemoglobin work, et cetera. But that was, of course, I shouldn't say, but that was overtaken really by molecular genetics when people got to the point where you could now clone the genes, and that became much more interesting. And whether you're trying to keep fetal hemoglobin going, like Stuart Orkin and folks have been doing for a long time, et cetera. And so the small molecule aspect fell into decreasing interest. But I think now that there are new aspects that allow, some of the new approaches to electron microscopic analysis of molecules, which allow you to predict much more accurately where those molecules will interact. And I think that is the kind of thing that puts excitement. And to the point that if you have, actually, Jonca, I think it speaks a little bit to your question about people going away from benign hematology. If you've got excitement there, if you've got things that people can do and they say, boy, this is a really exciting thing, it's as exciting as looking at breast cancer genes or whatever, then you'll have people coming into it. And I think that some of these new technologies could open that door.
Yeah, and I don't know that the genetics wave didn't deliver there. I mean, I think the understanding of the architecture and organization of the transcription locus for fetal globin, Stu Orkin and others have, opened the door for a lot of new small molecule targets for sickle cell disease. The question is always, true for biologics as well, is how do you control them, which is to say, how do you get their action to be at the locus you want in the genome of the cell that you want, and not in all the other cells and at any other locus. But that is a small molecule question. That is a design and engineering question. And I think there's a lot of activity still going on that building off that and trying to translate that.
And just a comment to piggyback on some of the things that were stated earlier. NIH, NHLBI has been very instrumental in moving some of these efforts forward. One of the ways that I, as a clinician and a clinical researcher, try to engage actually undergrads and medical students is through some of the opportunities through NIH and ASH that allow me to work with these students closely. And there's a new therapeutics grant through NIH, which is wonderful, which is basically asking academicians to look at pharma discarded molecules or therapeutic drugs to see if they are applicable in our disease of interest and to apply to get funding for that. And you can really take an up-and-coming scientist or clinical researcher under your wing and pull them along in this direction through these types of grant opportunities. The other thing that I think is very exciting is the area of microfluidics, and where you can actually in real time see what some of these drugs are going to do to the endothelial lining and interaction with other cells. And I know NHLBI just recently convened a panel around sickle cell disease and microfluidics. So I'm hoping that that means that something's going to come down the pike, hopefully, in that area, because I think that that's another way of taking a look at what may actually be happening biologically before we expose individuals living with sickle cell disease to therapies without a clear safety profile. So I think that that's another opportunity. And then lastly, as far as the manpower issues in sickle cell, I think that one of the things that we're going to have to do is until we can find the last romantics in medicine that are interested in taking the baton from now, I guess, dinosaurs in the sickle cell clinical care community, I think that there is another answer. And I think that is to incentivize being involved in the care of individuals living with sickle cell disease in all disciplines. And some of that has to go back to loan repayment. It's a no-brainer. It's easy. There's already a program in place under NIH to do it, and we just have to make sure that they can stamp it with a special condition for individuals who are interested in caring for those with sickle cell disease. It means they get an automatic thumbs up on their applications. So I think that even though it sounds like some of the barriers that we're facing are daunting, there are also a lot of good things coming down the pike.
Thank you. Other comments? Any parting thoughts from our panelists? If not, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank our very attentive and engaged audience. And I think we look forward to how this conversation is carried forward. I think there have been seeds planted of some wonderful ideas. I think we can share the excitement that there is innovation in sickle cell disease taking place, as well as the need for continued focus on both from investigators to caregivers and nurturing the next generation and a current generation of folks in that space. So thank you again very much. Thank you also for your patience with our delay. Thank you.